Ralph Schmidt advises our next group, who has been working with Opportunity Green.
Hi, thank you. I'm Manasa. I'm representing my group. We're going to continue talking about music artists and how they travel to different places. So our topic is how we tax aviation and the impact it would have on vulnerable countries. Two specific things that I'd like to say is we weren't tasked to explore if aviation taxation is possible or not, but instead assuming optimistically that taxing aviation is going to be in place and what impact it would have on these vulnerable countries. And speaking of aviation taxation, we're talking about taxing kerosene fuel that is used by aviation industry. Moving on. Oh, I understand now. So why do we have to tax aviation? So aviation accounts for 2.5% of the global CO2 emissions, which may not seem too much, but we know that transportation as a sector contributes number 2 to CO2 emissions, and most of the other modes of transport has a way to deal with emissions, but aviation has been neglected, specifically because they fear there's a misconception that these vulnerable nations, which we define as small island developing states and least developed countries, may be affected because most of their GDP is reliant on tourism. That being said, we also have the UN Loss and Damage Fund, which got operationalized last year, and it is also one of the major talks at the COP, which is insufficiently capitalized. So we wanted to see if we could have a separate revenue stream through the aviation taxation within the Loss and Damage Fund. Speaking of our client, it's Opportunity Green. They're based out of London. They're an NGO who's working on policy. They wanted to change the way they tackle climate change, and our topic is clearly in line with that. So we were again tasked to think that aviation taxation comes in place and what impact it would have on these vulnerable countries. Speaking of the scope, we did 3 different tasks. Number 1 was to come up with a list of top 10 vulnerable countries, which we did from both climate and economic risks, which is from the climate risks and the amount of GDP that is reliant on tourism for these countries. Second task was to do a quantitative modeling to see how, if we impose a minimal taxation, what impact it would have on, let's say, the total revenue or funding we have to use it for the adaptation costs, as well as how much of the passenger tickets are going to be affected, how much would it increase in the meanwhile. And the final task was to see what has to be done next. The next one is basically what kind of data we had. The first task, we looked at the actual climate risks and the economic risks. The second task, we took the actual ticket prices of an aviation model. Secondly, we used this tool called Solver on Excel to find out the minimal tax we could impose. And thirdly, we used the actual adaptation costs that these vulnerable countries need. Finally, we compared what the total revenue is with the adaptation costs that are required. These are the list of 10 countries that we came up with as a result of the first task, both based on climate risks, both physical and social, as well as the economic, how much of percentage of the GDP is reliant on tourism. Before we went on to the second task, which was to come up with a quantitative model to see how much it impacts passenger ticket prices, etc., we wanted to see who collects this tax and how does it finally end up going to these vulnerable nations. So we know we have these kerosene fuel suppliers who are going to tax the aviation companies, and they would obviously then pass this tax on to the passengers. We had 2 different options for that, one being the flat rate, the other one being based on the cabin classes. So we strongly suggest that this is more equitable because as people move up the ladder to go to the premium classes, they occupy more space, which means they contribute to more CO2 because they use a lot of fuel. On the other side, we wanted to see where this revenue is going to get pulled up and how does it finally flow into these vulnerable nations. So we know that the kerosene fuel suppliers have the tax revenue, which is now going to flow into the national tax authority of each country. And thanks to our faculty advisor, who's been working with the UNDP for many decades, who said that every year, every country has to contribute a set percentage towards the loss and damage fund. So this is a good way of contributing this revenue from the tax authorities of every government towards the UN Loss and Damage Fund, and then pass this on to the vulnerable nations. This is the comprehensive quantitative model, but I'm going to just discuss the findings. The tax rate that we propose is $0.05 per liter of kerosene, which is the minimal tax, and we came up with this using domestic rates of the US and Japan. We gave those conditions on Excel to use Solver to come up with this international tax for us. And then if this tax was going to be imposed, the revenue we can generate is about 284 billion. We took only the top 10 vulnerable countries and the top 10 developed countries. And if you look at the impact it has on the vulnerable countries, which is the main scope, they're able to offset 12% of their adaptation costs just by using the revenue they have generated from the aviation tax, by which we're trying to say they're reducing the risk of international aids that they have to wait for. Apart from this, we were looking at the passenger rates of tax, and you see that every trip is going to increase by about $20 to $40. So we did an elasticity to see. We couldn't do a survey because of the time. We'd love to do that. But if you look at the elasticity, you can assume that as people move up the ladder, the willingness to pay increases. And so the business and the first-class passengers would be ready to pay for it. So, and the framework, again, we're going to use the loss and damage fund. It's going to be enforced by the International Civil Aviation Organization, who are taking care of the legal aspects now. The challenges that we foresee coming is just bringing every single country into this. We're not proposing domestic tax just for a few countries, let's say developed countries. No, we're looking at international tax. Secondly, these vulnerable nations have always been kind of hesitant to be into this conversation because they fear GDP getting affected, but our findings are clearly showing that it doesn't prevent any majority of the passengers from traveling, so it doesn't affect their GDP. Third one being the ticket price. Again, how much does that $20 to $40, assuming the international ticket price is about $800 today, does it $20 to $40 impact someone from traveling is something that we have to find out. As the next steps, we ask our client to speak with different countries and lobby for this, basically showing that it is beneficial. The second one being just communicating this to the public, because we know as we think about aviation tax, what we're worried about is the ticket price. So we just have to communicate that investing in that $20 today is going to save so much of climate costs for tomorrow. Finally, just monitoring the whole thing. We're going to conclude by saying that aviation tax is absolutely beneficial for two reasons. Number one, for the vulnerable countries, it is only an additional revenue to offset their adaptation costs. It is not preventing any majority of the passengers from traveling, so it doesn't affect their GDP again. For climate, it is just unfair that an industry that has been ignored for a long time pays its price for the CO2 emissions that it is incurring today. The core benefits as such, again, speaking of just we were able to place ourselves within the head of the aviation companies, and we found out that they wanted to be competitive even after the tax is being imposed, which means they wouldn't want to pass this entire tax on to the consumers. Instead, they would want to reduce the cost in their operations. And we found out that right now it's 85% capacity before they fly. So they would want to make sure it's 100%, because if not, they would have to pay for that 15% taxation, which nobody wants to do. So 100% makes it more climate friendly as well. At the end of it, we're vouching for sustainable aviation fuel because we're penalizing CO2 emissions, fossil fuels, aviation industry. At the end of it, it has to promote motivation towards sustainable aviation fuel. And at the end of it, we want to say aviation tax is right now bilateral, and we're the first group to make this international tax look possible. And we also came up with a governing framework to do that, so it's not just theory. This is our wonderful team, and thank you. Questions?
Thanks, super interesting. Just because you brought up sustainable aviation fuels at the end, I'm just curious. I know currently there's a lot more demand for SAFs than there is supply.
Exactly.
So I'm just wondering if this is an additional kind of demand add. Just curious if you guys explored that.
Yeah, so what would happen is as we tax kerosene, it becomes expensive in the long run, right? So that makes aviation fuel cheaper. That's what happened with the renewables in terms of solar and wind. So yeah, that's the indirect benefit that we see coming, because the kerosene would be expensive in the long run and sustainable aviation fuel would be cheaper. So people would want to adapt to it today we don't have that much of motivation towards SAF, right? So at least this would penalize and indirectly lead to that is what we thought of, yeah. It makes sense.
Hi, great presentation. Did you consider a differential tax model whereby frequent flyers pay differently, say, compared to first-time travelers?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. So what we did was ultimately as you start, so we took the actual plane model. If you see 7,500 is the tax per flight, don't worry about it. And we allocated this based on different cabin classes. So as people, so you see $18 over here as the economy tax rate for one economy class, which means as they keep traveling, every time they have to pay extra. So at the end of it, we're penalizing, the frequent travelers because every time they have to pay that much. So yeah.
Hi, great presentation. I was wondering, you mentioned that your first step was identifying the climate risk per the location that you studied. And I was wondering why would you study this and how did that impact your tax calculation that you just showed in your model?
That's wonderful, yeah. So firstly, we came up with these 10 countries based on two things: climate risks, both physical and social, as well as how much of their GDP is reliant on tourism, which you will see in the model because the first top 10 are the vulnerable countries that you see here, and we calculated the actual GDP and the tax on the GDP to find out the actual adaptation costs, compared it with the total revenue that would be collected. So this is the significance of us doing the first task of coming up with these vulnerable countries. We also did the top 10 developed countries to see, you see the significant amount of tax that is coming out of that. So we're just trying to say there's more funding into the UN Loss and Damage Fund, which can be used for these vulnerable countries to come out of the climate problem they're into. Yeah. Thank you.